Hey guys, and welcome back to a very quick sit down video. I say quick, who knows how long this will actually be. But today we're going to talk about kind of the changes I've had since I started BookTube, because I've noticed a lot of differences in my reading for the good and the bad. And then I've come to some conclusions about them because I've really been reflecting on it recently. So without further ado, let's just get into it. First, I'm going to give you some background information. I used to read the same things over and over and over before BookTube, as evidenced by my shelf. I don't know how much you can see behind me, but I've got the entire Vampire Chronicles up here, which I just would read over and over and over. Like, some of them I read 4 or 5 times. I would read, the Dresden Files series over and over and over. Most of them I think I've read like 4 times. I would read Harry Potter, which is actually upstairs in my son's room because it's Harry Potter themed. I would read that over and over and over. And Game of Thrones was a big one. So I would just reread the same things because I just didn't know what else to read because I didn't have any recommendations to get. So of course that's going to be a pro here in just a minute. But I would read the same things, and then I only read physically. I hated other ways of reading. I hated ebooks. I could not stand the thought of staring at a screen when I wanted to hold a physical book. I hated audiobooks. I remember I literally told people that I would rather not read than have to listen to an audiobook, which ironically now the only time I have to read would be to listen to an audiobook, and I do choose to do that. So I was wrong. It turns out to be able to read, I will listen to an audiobook, but before I only would read physically. So that's really different before BookTube. And so those are kind of the main things that you need to know, the background. Now, why have I had such a change in my reading habits? Well, it kind of was everything that hit all at once. I literally, all like the same time, it was the pandemic, and I discovered BookTube right during the pandemic. I didn't even know it was a thing, and I started watching all these book-related videos, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I want to read, but I want to read new books, and all these books that are so popular that apparently I've missed out on all these years, that I've been rereading the same series over and over, so I've got to give all these new books a shot. And then what else? Oh, so watching tons of BookTube videos, getting recommendations. Then I was also, that was my first full year, like the pandemic hit my first year while I was a librarian here at my current school, in my current position. So I was trying to read like a lot of young adult books now. So that's kind of changed too, just my position that I was in. And then I wanted to read more books for videos once I started my own BookTube channel. I wanted to be able to review things. I wanted to be able to do monthly wrap-ups, and you can't do a monthly wrap-up if you've only read one book that month, you know? I mean, you could, but I thought that I had to read a lot. And now, of course, I don't even do monthly wrap-ups. I just do like recent reads wrap-ups because I don't care how many books I read every month at this point. And then the biggest change is I had a baby. That happened in February of 2021. A lot of this other stuff was like March or April of 2020. But basically within the span of a year, all those changes happened at once. And I think that's the cause of some of these changes. What are the changes? Well, obviously there's the preferred format. It's not that I still prefer to read physically, but I now have to listen to audiobooks. I think about 90 of the 100 books I listened to last year were audiobooks, and maybe the other 10 were like ebooks/physical books because that's the only time I have with having a baby. So that's changed a lot, but obviously BookTube has affected that because I want to read so much that the only way to do so was by audio. But I also can read ebooks now too, because where I don't really have time to go to the library as much. I do now more that my kid's older. He's like 3 now, but back when he was a little baby, it was hard to get to the library, especially like when it was pandemic times at the beginning and the library wasn't even open. Or then they had, curbside delivery and all this stuff. But I discovered Libby, and I would get audiobooks and ebooks from there and realize, hey, I can get this at the touch of a button. I don't have to wait to go to the library. I don't have to wait till somebody turns the book in. I don't have to put it on hold. It's just there if I want it. And Hoopla too. So I use those a lot and just read on my iPad now. And I am a fan of it. I'm not going to lie. I mean, sometimes I do get distracted with other things on my iPad or my phone if I'm reading on there, but it is nice, and I can have a book with me wherever because I can then just access it from my phone. Next is the length of book, which is really interesting because I used to love big books. Like I have shirts. I have 2 different shirts that say I love big books and I cannot lie. And it was true back in the day. I don't know if it's so true now, but when I would see one of these books up here, was like 500 plus pages, I would see a 1,000-page book and not be scared of it. Like The Witching Hour by Anne Rice is over 1,000 pages, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. So, I loved big books because I could get connected to the characters and the world, and I just wanted more of the story. I didn't want it to end. I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and couldn't get enough of it, and it was massive. So it wasn't that big books, scared me, obviously, but now it's not that they scare me. I think it's just that I want to just get through some of the books, and maybe it has to do with the fact in a minute I'll tell you about the genres I've changed to as well that are, honestly, the genres are shorter now. Like the books are shorter if I'm not reading as many fantasy books. Spoiler alert, that's coming up next. So I just kind of want to get through these books, and when I see maybe too, it's just seeing the length of it on audio, like knowing how long it's going to take. Because when I see these audiobooks that are 22 hours long or more, and I'm just like, that's gonna take a long time, even when I speed it up, like, oh gosh. But when I see a book's like 7 hours, I'm like, I can speed that up, make it like 5 hours. I can read that in, 3 days or something, if I have over an hour listening time per day, which I usually do. So another thing I kind of thought about too is that I almost prioritized, now last year, I didn't like think this in my head, but last year I kind of prioritized quantity over quality, because by the end of the year I wanted to reach that goal of 100 books, and I knew I had to just read shorter books. I read some little novellas that I hated, and I pushed through them just to make sure they help me make it to my goal of 100 books. And now this year I have no reading goal. Like, the goal was 1 book on Goodreads, so I don't care how many books I read, and I am going to try to prioritize quality over quantity. So I have listened to some long audiobooks. I've DNF'd some other long audiobooks, but I did listen to like the Elon Musk autobiography, and it was or biography, not autobiography, just regular biography, 12 or 22 hours, something like that for the audiobook. So I do still read some big books, but it is nice to at least break them up with the shorter books in between. So let's talk genres for a minute. I was pretty much a purely fantasy reader, or maybe like urban fantasy even. Like, of my 4 favorite series, the Dresden Files is set in the real world, but with magic. It's kind of like urban fantasy. Harry Potter is obviously still set in the real world, but with magic. And then Game of Thrones is set in a different world, and then the Anne Rice series, Vampire Chronicles, is in the real world. So, and of course it's not really like magic. I mean, it's like vampires. Like, there's not so much about the magic of it or anything. So I don't even know if you'd really call that fantasy. I don't even know what you call the genre of the Vampire Chronicles. But those were my 4 favorites. And obviously I never really was super into like high fantasy anyway. And I've discovered that's kind of the case now, where I like books that have a magical element, but they're set in the real world. Like, some of my most recent 5-star books are like Vicious, which is set in the real world. Slade House, which is set in the real world. Library at Mount Char, set kind of in the real world. So, but it was sort of, and it had like real people in it, but I think they kind of went to like this other dimension. Is that what it was? Or like another area that was sort of like another world. I don't know. So I did learn that, maybe I was not reading the right kind of fantasy books when I was trying so hard on BookTube to like some of these high fantasy books, because I've never really liked high fantasy. But I will say that BookTube has caused me to really branch out and try mysteries, thrillers, which I was always kind of a little bit into mystery, maybe even thriller, but not so much horror. Like, I have been more into horror, and I did read A God in the Shed last year, which I gave 5 stars. Could not believe it. Like, I gave 5 stars to a horror book. Who am I? It was so, so good. You should definitely read it. And I have to say, I've even been reading a little bit more realistic, very little realistic fiction, but at least some, as opposed to none, which was what I used to do. And then even a tiny bit of romance, which I don't like any of them, but like, I've read some Emily Henry and a couple Christina Lauren books, and like, they're okay. I actually did give 4 stars to one Christina Lauren book, what's it called? In a Holidays, and I've even read it twice because it was such a Christmassy book. I wanted to read it. And finally, I think the last reason that I don't read as much fantasy is because it's so hard on audio. Like, if I have an audiobook, I cannot look at the maps, the appendices, the, family trees, things like that you might have in a typical like high fantasy novel that's set in, another world and has all this like world building. It's hard to pay attention to the world building in an audiobook. It really is, especially if you're multitasking, which I always am when I'm listening to these audiobooks and I'm trying to get ready in the morning. I'm trying to drive, do any, I'm tired at nighttime. So it's like, my mind wanders a little bit. And if you miss like one thing in a fantasy book, you might kind of miss a really key point, or like how the magic works or something, or who a character is. And then you have to rewind, or else you're just like, oh, I really don't know what's going on. And you get kind of frustrated with the book. And I've clearly been through this. I've had that happen to me a lot. So I would say that because the fact that fantasy is so hard on audio, I've had to kind of resort to other genres, but have discovered that I actually do like some of these other genres as well. Next is reading level. I used to pretty much read adult books only, even like when I was younger. I mean, obviously I read like Harry Potter and stuff, but my favorite series were always like adult books. Like, I was reading Anne Rice when I was 14 years old. I know I kind of skipped the YA books, and now, of course, YA was not a huge thing when I was in school. Like, that's really been a thing since then. I sound really old when I say that, but there weren't tons of YA books back in the day. So I would say that I now read, a decent amount of YA books, but obviously I'm a high school librarian, so I like to do that for my job anyway. And I've discovered some pretty good ones out there. I Hunt Killers, you know who you are. I love that book. Middle grade. I've read a couple middle grade books only because of BookTube, because I discovered Gavin now his channel is called Gavin Reads It All, but it was called How to Train Your Gavin. And then also Jade from JD Ray Reads. They both really got me into middle grade. Ironically, they are both now out of their middle grade eras, and they don't really talk about middle grade on their channel anymore. But years ago, when I first started watching BookTube in 2020, they were talking about middle grade a lot, and I started reading some of the books that they recommended, and that's how I found the Nevermore series. 5-star series, love every single book, cannot wait for the next book. It's the closest thing in feeling to Harry Potter that I've ever read. And it's middle grade, so highly recommend Nevermore. So I think just getting to read some more books from different age ranges has been fun. And the last category is kind of just like random stuff, like how I process the material I feel like is different than I used to because I read so much. I don't have time to just sit here and like stew on each book and really think about the characters, which is kind of a negative, kind of really, because used to I would read discussion board posts and I'd read fan fiction, you know, for whatever series I was obsessed with, but I don't get those obsessions anymore. I just, you know, I find a book I love and give 5 stars and then I move on. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be one of my favorite books of all time, but I guess I'm not going to think about it anymore because I'm already on to the next book. It's just constant, one book after another. Even during the process of reading the book, I'm not sitting there just like thinking about it all the time like I feel like I used to do with books. Maybe it's because I'm not reading big series though. And I'm also not having to wait for series to come out like I used to do with like Harry Potter and even Anne Rice. I had to wait for some of the books to come out in that series. And Dresden Files, I would always have to wait for the books. Game of Thrones, well, we're still waiting on the books. We won't talk about that. Maybe they'll never be done. Who knows? But yeah, I'm just not as like involved with the books as I used to be. But ironically, in kind of a different sort of twist, is that I now also feel like I read books to help you guys somewhat. I mean, not really. I read them for myself, but it's fun to know that like, hey, I actually have an audience I could recommend these books to. Like if I love a book, I can do a book review about it, which I haven't done in a long time because I don't really find very many 5-star reads anymore. But when I did my Library at Mount Char spoiler-free like rapid review, I think it's got like 500 views or something now. And I was like, oh my gosh, I might have helped like hundreds of people find a book that is really, really good. And I need to do more of those rapid reviews because I didn't do one for God in the Shed. I think I did one for Slade House. I don't know. I need to do one for like every 5-star book I read because they're so good. So a few negative things I thought about before I kind of come to conclusions here is that, you know, one, I don't get as connected to the books. I said I have to read a book and then immediately move on to the next one. And I don't think about it much outside of the time I'm like reading it. And then my attention span seems so limited now that it's almost kind of like hard to focus on books when I do read them physically. I like sit down to read physically. I'm like, I can't sit down and just read. I have to be doing something else. I have to be multitasking, you know, just reading what? And then when I do read, yeah, it's kind of hard just to focus on it. Conclusions. In conclusion, I really thought about it. I looked at all this evidence. I wrote all this down. I typed it all out. And I concluded that I've just had to adapt. I mean, that's just what it is. I've had to adapt because I had a baby, because I decided I want to read a ton more, because I do have access to more physical or more ebooks and audiobooks than ever. Like I never had this access. I don't even know if Livia existed, you know, years and years ago. Probably not. So just having the access has kind of allowed me to adapt, whereas my other circumstances have like forced me to adapt, including being a young adult librarian and needing to read more young adult books. And another conclusion is that this is temporary. You know, I can change back into more of a physical reader later, or both. I can do like audio and physical, whatever I want to do. So maybe it's kind of a good thing because like Ash is going to get older, right? Obviously, and I'm going to have more time to read. He's going to want to hang out with his friends more or whatever, you know, or play a sport and I just have to sit there while he has practice, you know, whatever it is. I think I'll have more physical reading time later on and I can't wait. I don't want my child to grow up, obviously. Like I want to keep him this age because 3 years old is wonderful. He's so cute and precious, except for tonight when he was a little terror, but we won't talk about that. So I think as he gets older, I'll have more physical reading time. But my big conclusion then is that at least I have learned to branch out. I'm not going to read the same series over and over again. I'm going to read different genres than I used to read, at least somewhat. I'll probably never read historical fiction, but anyway, I will read different age ranges than I used to read. I'll just be a more diverse reader in the end, and I think that that's going to be a really good thing. But in the end, you know, I still can't figure out what makes a 5-star book for me. That'll be a whole other video. What in the world is the 5-star criteria for me? Because I don't know. So thank you guys so much for watching this random video. I just really, really wanted to sit down and think about these things. And I thought, you know, I really want to do it in a way that I actually have to plan it out. And then I thought, well, I'll just share it with you guys too in case you're interested. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. And if you also join BookTube or make BookTube videos, maybe you can tell me if this is normal. Like, do other people go through all of this? I don't know. Or is it just my strange circumstances because it all happened sort of at the same time for me in my life? But anyway, thank you all so much for watching and I will talk to you again later. Bye.